Thanks very much, Janine, and thank you for the invitation to come along this morning. It's brilliant to be here, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some of our thoughts on community wealth building. But I think most importantly, hearing from all of you about how what we're going to say this morning resonates, and also to hear about your experiences of community wealth building and local economic development wherever you are in the world. It's interesting, Janine, you were saying that you're looking towards autumn in South Africa. In Manchester, it's a fabulous time of year because we're just starting to feel a little bit of warmth in the sun, and everything's kind of coming into blossom. So it's I think we're both in kind of enjoying different time of the year. So this morning, I'm going to, myself and Julian are going to talk you through the work that CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, our logo is just in the bottom right corner there. The work that we've done on local economic development and community wealth building in the UK and Ireland, and also that we've shared with other parts of the world as well, and very much inspired by the work of the Democracy Collaborative, who also work globally also. And I'm sure much of what we'll say today will be familiar, but hopefully with some of the insights that we've taken from our work in the UK. So I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to introduce Julian. Julian, do you want to just say a few words as well?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Julian. I'm working as head of local economies at CLES. I've been here for about just since January, so not long. Before that, I have a background in international development. I did some research in East Africa for my PhD, looking at industrialization in the region. So yeah, I'm really interested to bring together kind of the UK focused community wealth building with some international perspectives and thinking about how it links to development economics. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion at the end and hearing your thoughts on what we've presented.
Thanks, Julian. And I'm Sarah Longlands, and I'm the Chief Executive of CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. My background is local economic development. I've worked in NGOs and in government, and I'm really interested in the relationship between economic growth and human development, and that's been very much the focus of my research in the last 10 years or so. So let me just run through what we're going to do today, this morning. Our presentation is going to cover a little bit more about CLES and our work in the UK and Ireland. We're going to talk about the economic context in the UK and how that influences the work that we do. We're going to give you a bit of an introduction to what we understand as community wealth building. We're going to talk through some examples of where we've seen it working. And then I guess the good bit, kind of opening up for questions and for discussion, and very much to hear your thoughts on what we've said. So that's the overview for this morning. So let me just start off by telling you a little bit about CLES. So CLES is the UK's national organisation for local economies. We're a charity. We're based in Manchester. We were established back in 1986, and we were established really by a number of local councils, local authorities, who were running services at the local level across the UK, and they realised that they wanted to be able to understand how they could effectively intervene in the local economy to support people, planet, and place. And for us, that's about wealth and power serving local people rather than the other way around, and really about enabling people and communities to flourish and for people to live a life that they have a reason to value. And we've got, over the last sort of 10 years or so, our reputation for work in community wealth building has grown, and we very much feel that we help to support and lead the movement in the UK. Our work is very varied. We do all sorts of different types of work. We do lots of events. We do a lot of our own independent research. We work with local councils in the UK. We work with NGOs, all really looking at how do our local economies work. How can we use the tools at our disposal through employment, through investment, and through our expenditure? How can we use those tools to really intervene effectively in local economies and create good outcomes in terms of jobs and community development for people across the UK? So that's a little bit about us. And our approach is very much about, acting as a critical friend to local economies, kind of really working with people, building relationships, helping places to develop new solutions and alternatives to perhaps the sort of standard economic approach that many of us we will be familiar with across, not just the UK but across the world. And I think we're also trying to be advocates for change. We're trying to say to people, look, we don't have to accept the standard economic approach. There is an alternative, and there is a way of building an economy which generates good lives for people. It doesn't have to simply be about GVA or about growth at any cost. We can do it in a way which is authentic and respects local identities and existing businesses and communities. And I think our tactic in this is very much about kind of doing the independent research, about building progressive coalitions, trying to amplify good practice. Because in our work, and I'm sure it's similar where you work, there's lots of brilliant examples of small projects, of communities working together with their partners. But I think trying to amplify that and trying to get those messages out there to give other people doing that work the support and the help that they need to be able to enable local economies to really reach their full potential and to work in the interests of local people. So that's a little bit about our approach. And I think for us, the context that we're working with in the UK means that this work is become kind of more important than ever, because there are some real challenges with the UK's economic model, which may not always be apparent, but we have, in cities like Manchester, London, some of you have coming here from London will know this as well, even more. It's a really, we've got an economy which is very reliant on an overheated property market, and an economic property market which is very speculative. So people investing not because they want to buy homes, but because they want to invest in pension funds or private equity, wherever it happens to be. So the property market's become about making a buck on the stock market or servicing your debts rather than providing good homes for people to live in. So there's a real big issue with that in the UK, and it's become like a sort of cultural thing as well. That people feel that they as part of the process of life is sort of capital accumulation. I think there's also a big focus on foreign direct investment as the answer to a lot of challenges in parts of the UK. And almost saying, come and invest in our place, and that the benefits will be automatic. But our experience has been that quite often that's very fly by night. It's very extractive. It's very exploitative, and it often produces very little benefit for local communities. And I think as well, we've also got a real challenge with what we would call extractive companies. So companies who are very much not based in the UK, not paying taxes in the UK, but kind of hoarding wealth for distant shareholders. So that's some of the issues that we've got in the UK, and a lot of that leads to quite fragile employment, quite fragile job opportunities, and 0 hours contracts. So and a lot of work in the informal economy as well. And it also means, real challenges in terms of the quality of life. So we know that in many parts of the UK, life expectancy, particularly healthy life expectancy, is falling for many women. We did some research recently looking at gender equality in one of the cities in the north of England, and we saw really distinct and worrying trends about healthy life expectancy. So that's the age at which you can expect to live a healthy life, free from illness or disease. That age is falling in parts of the north of England. And also we're seeing life expectancy more generally stalling in many parts of the UK. And you can have a difference of as much as 10 years life expectancy difference within one city like London. So real challenges there in terms of what our economy is producing in terms of good lives. Problems around poverty. In parts of England, we've got a third of children living in poverty. Destitution, there's a big rise in destitution across the UK. And much of that is fueled by the kind of dysfunction of our property market, particularly for people who are renting. And we've also, like all of us in this room, got real challenges around climate emergency, and that feels like it's escalating rapidly in many parts of the UK. So this is the sort of this part of the presentation where it's all a bit kind of depressing, really. Never mind the wider international challenges that we're dealing with, there's a real issue here with the economic model in the UK kind of really failing for people, place, and planet. And for us, one of the ways that we try to understand this at CLES is by just trying to compare and contrast levels of poverty, average incomes, and GDP. And you can see that on this graph. So the red line on this graph on the left-hand side is our GDP in the UK. The yellow line is our rate of poverty. And the blue line at the bottom is our average incomes. And you can see how we've got a real gap between the rate of GDP growth and the degree to which that makes a difference to people's direct experience of life. So we're not seeing a relationship between necessarily poverty and GDP. It's a kind of a relationship with diminishing returns, you might say. And in terms of incomes, we're seeing that actually going in the opposite direction for GDP. So there's something not quite right about our model. And one of my experiences of working in the UK and other parts in Ireland particularly is that wherever you go, people say we want our economy to grow. We want economic growth, and generally that's measured through something like GDP. And there's an assumption that if we can just get the economy to grow, then everyone will benefit. But one of the issues with that idea is that, well, what do you do in the meantime while you're waiting for growth to arrive? And what do you do if that growth never comes? Does that mean you're just saying to people, sorry, that we can't have any human development because we're not seeing growth? So I think that's the question then about government intervention, and how do we address where markets are failing, and what does that mean in terms of human development? And for us, there's also a question here, particularly in the UK economy. We have a lot of wealth in the UK. Let's not pretend that we don't, but that wealth is not serving the communities that actually create it. And I think that's a real challenge for all of us working in this field, where if we're seeing wealth in a place, who is benefiting from that wealth? Who gets to say, who's got a voice in that conversation about how wealth is shared and allocated? And what is the role of intervention, of government intervention, to try and level the playing field, to ensure that more people benefit from that wealth, and that wealth is put to good use to actually reduce inequality and alleviate poverty? So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to hand over to Julian for the next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, on the back of all that, we'll come to explain community wealth building as a response to that situation, which is, I'm sure, is familiar to you in a lot of your countries and places. This kind of extractive model of development and growth not really working for all parts of the community. So community wealth building is a people-centered approach to local economic development, which redirects wealth back into the local economy and places control and benefit into the hands of local people. That's the kind of overall idea. It's about increasing the flow, the circulation and ownership of wealth or surplus within a place, and democratizing the economy by building wealth from within. And then in terms of measurement, it's about measuring the economy by how well it generates good lives rather than just focusing on GDP growth. So let's get into it in a bit more detail. One of the main mechanisms that community wealth building works by is through anchor institutions. That's kind of a key concept in the schema of things. So an anchor institution is one that has the necessary economic impact to be able to play a role beyond its prime function as a force for good in the local economy. And they're also anchored in like a specific geography which they can't move from. So in the UK, we often think about these as local councils, local authorities, which are the kind of level of government below the national government and below the kind of regional mayors. So it's a little different in each country, but we have around 317 different local authorities. So they're obviously, there's a lot of them, and they might be for a city or a town, and there's various levels of them. But they could also be hospitals in places, universities, colleges, housing associations, as well as large private sector companies that are rooted in a place, as opposed to a kind of footloose international company that can just withdraw its investment if circumstances change. But in a smaller country, these can also be national government. So the Scotland, for instance, has a national community wealth building plan. They could also be regional levels of government in a federal system. They could, yeah, so there's different levels of anchor institutions, which obviously would have different levels of resources to influence the direction of their economy within their like geographic sphere. So yeah, these organizations have an economic impact through their employment, as well as being purchasers of goods and services in their local economy. They may also have access to, they may also control areas of land and have like fixed assets which could be deployed in different ways for different purposes in the community. And yeah, feel free to jump in with any questions or put them in the chat if any of this isn't kind of quite making sense, and maybe we can like try and tease it out for different contexts. And I guess in terms of aid spend in the global south, I think we could also think of aid donors as being anchor institutions or some of the suppliers that aid donors work with as well. Okay, so then let's come to a bit more onto those levers of community wealth building, some of which I just mentioned. So we think of kind of 5 different key pillars or levers of community wealth building. Across them all is plural ownership of the economy. So this is all about trying to change the ownership structure away from kind of companies that are owned by a small number of shareholders or a small number of very rich individuals, and yeah, spreading wealth through ownership of assets which are owned by the community or owned in common, so that wealth is shared through the generation of economic surplus. Wealth is then shared through different parts of the community. So if it's a worker-owned cooperative, then it's still a company that's producing a surplus, but the profit might go to the workers that own it rather than to a small number of shareholders. And that ownership can take place, can kind of be changed through different levers that anchor institutions have. So for instance, through progressive procurement, which is one of the most commonly used kind of levers of councils in the UK, is the procurement spend that they have to make in the course of their operations. So by, for instance, directing spend to local SMEs, small companies, worker-owned cooperatives, socially owned enterprises, there's different ways that they can redirect their spend to make an impact in their communities, as well as, for instance, the use of land and property. If a council has access to an area of land that's not being used, can this be deployed in a different way? Can it be kind of leased to or kind of given at a very low rent to a progressive small local business, which can use it to have a better impact on the community? Or can it be used to support affordable housing, for instance, that isn't, as opposed to private-led property investment that is unaffordable for most people? Also finance. So many anchor institutions have to have financial resources, whether it's in the form of pension funds or there may be community banks that they can work with. So trying to kind of rewire the finances of a place to make sure that it's less extractive, so that it's not just about large banks or lenders who are making profits from their ownership of the financial system. So there's examples, yeah, we'll come to of kind of local councils setting up community banks or working closely with community banks to have low rates of interest for local people, for instance. And then on employment, often anchor institutions employ a large number of people in their communities, or they may not employ them in their communities and be employing people from outside those areas. So how can they not only make sure that the most marginalized people in their communities have access to work? For instance, hospitals might have lots of vacancies in entry-level positions in the UK at the moment, because of difficulties in finding like workforce. So how can you make sure that there are progression routes into good jobs, and that these actually provide good wages through kind of commitments to pay the living wage, for instance, in the UK is a big debate right now, and making sure that, yeah, employment pays well. Okay, so in terms of that plural ownership of the economy, this graph just kind of spells that out a bit more. So we have the kind of purpose on the y-axis, being more socially generative at the top, more purpose driven and profit driven at the bottom, and then the models of ownership on the x-axis, like more with a smaller number of individual shareholders on the left hand side, going to more socially owned businesses on the right hand side. So we have more extractive companies in the lower left, like corporations, and more worker owned cooperatives in the top right, and between them kind of small private businesses, and then bigger companies like the triple bottom line, kind of more ESG focused, socially driven, but still private companies. So it's about shifting the economy from extractive to generative, to try and spread wealth more evenly, essentially. Okay, so just to dig into some of those pillars in a bit more detail. So currently, cost for the spending pillar, the procurement aspect of things, cost is often the dominant determining factor in who gets contracts. Many anchor institutions, they might have a catering contract, for instance, for all of the schools in the area, and they let that to a large business from outside their area because that's the lowest cost provider, and that business might buy in all the ingredients from outside the area. They might employ workers from different parts of the country and just bring in the food, for instance, at the lowest possible cost, whereas the value of that contract therefore doesn't provide much additional benefit to the community apart from the actual food that's delivered. Whereas if there was a way to spend that money with like smaller caterers in the area, there'd be a lot more jobs that would be created locally, a lot more potential kind of dense supply chains that would be benefiting different suppliers in the area. So yeah, we think about how anchor institutions can change their procurement processes to create dense local supply chains and support local businesses which employ people and circulate wealth in the area. And I was just thinking about, with development economics, we talk a lot about increasing linkages between different parts of the economy, densifying supply chains in a similar way. How can you get foreign direct investment to link to local supply chains rather than having enclaves or kind of export processing zones which have very minimal links to the local economy and just leave when things get difficult. If there's a raise in minimum wage and that company just leaves, that doesn't shows that they're not very embedded in the local economy. So I think there's a lot of parallels here, which would be great to come to in a bit. Just on land and property. So in the UK, land ownership is incredibly concentrated in a small number of people. The least wealthy 30% have no property wealth at all. So yeah, there's various ideas and experiments in how to use anchor institutions to change that. And the vision is that assets are owned and managed in ways which ensure and they generate wealth for local people. So there's a movement towards community land trusts, public common partnerships in the UK, ways to share land ownership and provide affordable access to housing, providing renewable energy that's owned by the community, for instance. And yeah, I guess in terms of development economics, there may be kind of interesting parallels in terms of extractive agriculture models, land grabs, how to have models of agriculture that are based in shared ownership of the resources and the outputs as well. Yeah, moving to finance. So in the UK, the banking sector is oriented to global markets rather than local investment. Often small businesses really struggle to get access to credit at affordable rates, and stagnation. There's been a stagnation of lending especially since the financial crisis in 2008 to small businesses. So there's various ways that anchor institutions can try to use their financial muscle to channel investment to local communities, as well as delivering returns for investors. So pension funds, for instance, in the UK, local councils have significant pension fund assets to pay pensions to their retired staff. But often these assets are invested in international markets, in large companies which don't have any impact in their local community. So there are efforts to try to redirect those resources into, for instance, investment in housing in the local area, in investing in local businesses that have a positive impact in the actual community that the council is responsible for. There may be ways to that the councils can use their financial resources to kind of put them with local credit unions, which can then be lent out locally to small businesses and provide that credit which is so needed to grow and employ people. And various other kind of community banks as well. And then finally, then in terms of employment, we mentioned this rise in work poverty through the use of 0-hour contracts, just the deindustrialization of the UK, essentially, as different manufacturing industries have left the country, as globalization has really hit working class communities in the UK. We've seen falling wages alongside increasing inflation, especially in the last few years since the COVID pandemic. So there's this real kind of crisis in employment, and anchor institutions, some of them have responded really positively with paying the living wage themselves. So the living wage is linked to the cost of living, and so rises if inflation rises. As well as requiring their suppliers to pay living wages. So these are ways that anchor institutions can have a bit of an impact on the labour market, even though they might not be able to change the kind of nationally mandated minimum wage directly, because they don't have those powers. But yeah, as well as building progression routes into local anchor institutions like the hospitals, for instance, and we'll come to an example of that. I think I'll hand over here, but this is just to say, that anchor institutions have this power to build a strategic vision for their place. They can consider what kind of economy we want to build, like whether it's extractive or generative, what kind of human development outcomes do we want to focus on, health, education, and fundamentally, how do we minimize extraction and this predatory capitalist model and build a more prosperous economy in place for everyone? Yeah, so thanks for listening. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to just finish off by just talking us through some examples of where we've seen this in action in the UK. I think what's interesting about the conversation on community wealth building is that it kind of is about rediscovering the economic power of government, because I think sometimes we're told that government is not part of the economy. You kind of got the market and you've got the state, and they don't that you can't mix them up. And I think what we've really been keen to explore with the people that we work is actually, government is part of the economy, and government in many respects is a foundation stone for the economy. You need good education, you need health in order to build a decent economy. You can't simply get it by hoping that capitalism or growth will spit it out at the other end. So I think that's very much at the heart of what we would argue, and I think that's been very much the inspiration in this first example in Preston. So Preston's a small town, it's about 120,000 people in the north of England, went through really serious deindustrialization in the 80s and 90s. And their story was one of a place that was trying to build, back in 2006, 2007, they were trying to encourage new investment into quite a disadvantaged part of the city. And it was the basis of getting investment to build a shopping centre. And they had it all kind of nearly sorted. They had the developer lined up. They had the investment all ready to go. They'd signed off on all the permissions. But then the financial crash hit, the global financial crash of 2008, and the whole thing fell through overnight. And all that investment disappeared off the face of the earth for them. So they sort of, it was a kind of a light bulb moment for them. It was a realization, why are we trying to play this global investment game that we will probably, where all the cards are stacked against us? And they decided to try a different approach. And they decided to try a community wealth building approach. And so they started to think, well, we wanted this investment to build a better future for people in our area. What if we used our own resources and our own investment and that of other non-government organizations, as well as government organizations within our town? So they worked. So we worked with the council and 6 anchor organizations, which included the university, the hospital, the local college, and we worked with them to sort of think, well, where is their money going at the minute? And so we looked at all of their expenditure on goods, on services across the city, and we mapped it. So we mapped out, well, how much of that money is going into, for example, areas where there's very high child poverty, or areas where there's very poor health. How much of that money is actually going there? How many people are we employing as a non-government organization or as a government organization that actually live in the communities, and particularly those communities that are most disadvantaged? So we did that work, and we found, for example, that there wasn't a lot of money that the council was spending actually finding its way into those communities. And so over the next few years, the council and those other anchor organizations worked to try and increase the spending with city-based suppliers and in creating jobs in those communities. And so they've seen a 200% increase over 5 years. They've also committed to what we would pay, what we call in the UK, the real living wage, which is higher than the minimum wage. And reflects kind of local kind of economic conditions. They also created 1,600 local jobs. They created, they were kind of really kind of founders of new cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives in food and in tech. And anchor organizations pledged to use those organizations to provide supply and other services within their organizations. And they also have been looking at how they could use their own, because local government pension scheme is extensive in the UK, but it's often very much, invested in propositions that are, have nothing to do with the local area. So they've actually invested some of their pension funds in the locality. And they're also exploring the possibility of local municipal energy. And it's always difficult to demonstrate attribution, but there is some evidence of impact. So Preston has been described as the most improved place to live in the UK. And we've also had peer-reviewed research published in the Lancet journal in the UK, which has looked at that this Preston model, if you like, has led to improved mental health and life satisfaction and wages. And I can post a link to that if people are interested in reading more about that. So that's an example from Preston. The next example is, Julian mentioned it earlier on in the presentation, Scotland have taken a national approach to this. And they are the first national government to really adopt community wealth building as an approach. They've got a minister for community wealth, and they're also proposing community wealth building legislation later this year. And it's been very much central to their idea of the well-being economy, a way to deliver a well-being economy for the country. And there's also a number of different places rolling out pilots on how that can be mainstreamed and scaled up. I think it's worth saying as well that Wales, although Scotland and Wales are part of the UK, Wales and Scotland have got their own national assemblies. And in Wales, they've also diverged from the UK economic model, and they have got a big focus on the foundational economy. So kind of valuing what you might call, the everyday economy, health, education, services within government, those kind of really kind of nuts and bolts of how economies work that keep economies kind of afloat. And Wales have done something really similar there and prioritised that in legislation. So Scotland and Wales both doing kind of national approaches to community wealth building. The next example is on locally owned renewables, and there's a lot of work on this in the UK and particularly in Scotland. A lot of interest in how can we kind of decentralise the energy system, which I know will be familiar to many of you as well. And some of the research suggests that community renewables retain 7 times more value in the local economy than commercial models. So one example of that, Plymouth, a small town in the south of England. The local government kind of used their land ownership really creatively to support a community organisation to develop a solar array, and that has delivering revenue for local government, but also for the local community. So that's some kind of much more about climate crisis and renewable energy, and showing the link across there as well. And I think we've got another example, which is it's one of my favorites actually. It's called the ICANN project in Birmingham. So I mean, Birmingham is a massive city in the kind of Midlands of the UK of England. And this came out of COVID as well. So during COVID, the hospitals in Birmingham were really short-staffed. They couldn't get enough people to work to fill some of the roles that they had in what was an acute crisis. And they were talking to other partners around the table, other anchor organisations, and they realised that some of the social housing organisations were really concerned that their residents didn't have access to good jobs. So what the hospital trust have done in Birmingham is basically just kind of ripped up their recruitment process. They've just got rid of the traditional recruitment process and instead taken jobs to the community. So they've gone to East Birmingham, highest levels of deprivation, highest levels of disadvantage, a third of children in poverty. And they've basically set up camp there to say to people, look, we've got job vacancies, we've got opportunities available. Have you ever thought about working in health and social care? And there's no kind of formal interviews. It's a cup of coffee. They've simplified all of the job descriptions, so it's like just some some sort of broad categories. And wraparound support for people who perhaps have never worked, and wraparound support to help them work out, well, what do you need? What would it take for you to be able to think about, having getting into employment? What are some of the barriers that you're trying to overcome? It might be childcare, it might be caring for an older relative, it might be health. Can we work with you to support you through that process? And they've now got nearly 500 people into jobs in the hospital, and they've got a really high retention rate of sort of 85-90% retention rate, which is really high in the scheme of things. And they've also been able to really target communities of disadvantage as well, who otherwise would never have considered a job in the hospital. So it's a good example, I think, of government recognizing that they have an economic role to play, that they can provide good jobs for people who perhaps wouldn't have accessed those jobs. And once they're in the job market, then in a sense they're available to anyone. They then could go on to take up jobs in the private sector or in NGOs. And of course, they've also now got a higher income and better able to support their families. So that's it kind of makes sense, really, when you think about it. But so sometimes it's just kind of pointing it out and making it happen. So yeah, as it says, there are 550 job offers, a little bit more than I said, and 97% retention rate on the latest figures. So I think, have we got one more, Julian? I think, yeah, no, that takes us to the end. Yeah. So yeah, I hope that's been useful. I'd be really interested to get people's thoughts on what Julian and I have been saying during this conversation. And we've just posted up some questions there, hopefully to get the conversation started. Really interested in what resonated with your experience elsewhere. What are some of the parallels between community wealth building in the UK and approaches to economic development in your places or community development? To what extent is it applicable, do you feel, from the examples that we've given? What are maybe some of the differences as well as the opportunities? What are local organisations in your areas doing already to support their economy? It might be through spend, investment, recruitment. And I guess as well, a bit of a challenge as to what are central government aid donors and investors in places where you're working, what are they doing to kind of really build community wealth alongside green growth. So thanks again. It's been really good to start this conversation with you, and we've just posted up some of our contact details at the end as well, in case there's anything that we've said that you want to follow up on. And I'll also include a link to our website as well in the chat, so people can look at some of the publications that we've referenced. So back to you, Janine.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah and Julian. That was very, very interesting. I think for me, just to sort of kick off the discussion, I'm living in a municipality that for the first time was voted, the opposition to the ruling ANC was voted into power in 2021. And we have an incredibly dynamic and young mayor. His name is Chris Papas. He's a white man. He's a farmer's son, but he speaks fluent Zulu, which is a very important aspect of being able to connect with people in the community. And having lived here since 2021, I can just see the difference in how he runs the municipality, how he's getting the local economy going. And I think one of the examples, we had someone come and do some work on our roof just recently, and he was so excited because he said, I'm so sorry, I have to rush off to the municipal offices to hand in my forms, because for the first time, the municipality is asking us as local contractors and builders to submit tenders for various jobs that are happening. And he said, I've worked in this area for 30 years, and it's always been so difficult for me to get in, because in the previous the previous government, they were always giving jobs to their friends and cousins, and there was all that kind of corruption going on. And he said, for now, I've got a chance to be part of building my local economy. And we've seen just in these 3 short years how it's different. And I think I see we've got Hannah, my colleague, in the asset-based community development field, and this just speaks to me about the whole idea of generating and circulating money within the economy so that the rest of the town benefits. And it's just, as you say, it's such a no-brainer, and yet it becomes difficult because we are stuck in older policies, and we're stuck in government rules, and we're stuck in bureaucracy and so on. And it's just when you kind of make that switch and change and do something differently and say, well, let me use the local lady. She can run the tuck shop at the school. Or, we get our veggies from our local farmers. We don't have to go all the way down to Durban and get vegetables in with, a big corporate that doesn't actually need the money. And I think it's just that, it's that mind shift. And that's the thing that when we talk about in the ABCD field, it's that idea of just getting people to think differently. And once you kind of get it, then the opportunities just pop up all over the place. Oh, we could do this, we could do that. And it's just, it's all about that mind shift for me. So it's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I that really resonates with me, because I mean we've worked with I remember working with a head of finance at a hospital a few years ago, and we talked it through, and it was like a light bulb going on, and he was like, "Oh right, yeah, okay, because he hadn't quite made the connection before, but suddenly he realized that there was a way that he could make a more direct difference. So yeah, it's yeah.
Any other comments, contributions from the floor? Hannah, would you like to add something from your perspective? You've done a lot of work with municipalities in Johannesburg.
Thanks, Janine. It was 2 wonderful presentations. I've learned a lot. And I think we're trying to do the same things, and we teach our students to use the assets in their communities, use what they are, so we are very much asset-based orientated. But many times we get the idea that, the government is far away, and the people are struggling, and they're working on their own year and gathering some, mapping some assets, start doing some small income generating projects, but government isn't on board as what I have heard from you now. And it's fascinating, they're trying and they do a lot now, and they are becoming engaged, but Janine, it's not really there. You talk about the minister, you talk about a national approach in Scotland, which is not the case here yet, you know, but we are working towards it, you know, and our people are so dependent. I think to break this dependency syndrome, and it comes from many years back, like from the apartheid years, you know, and it's difficult to really to break it. But we are getting there, slowly but surely. But it's amazing what you have achieved. And I'll really just salute you for that. I wasn't aware that there are so many unemployed, so high poverty in your country. You know, it's very high, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you for your
thanks, Hannah.
contribution.
No, thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Julie.
And maybe Sarah and Julian, you could just highlight for us maybe some of the ways in which you have managed to engage with government, with the local policymakers, because I think, I don't know about people in the rest of Africa as well, that is a challenge for us on this continent, is the idea of how do we, because as you say, government is there, they're doing their thing, they often are obstacles to our efforts. And so people, there's almost like this tension between the non-profit or the kind of, you know, public sector, and then government is over there and they stopping us and coming up with all these rules that we have to, hurdles that we have to jump over. How do we forge that kind of thing where we actually all on the same page?
Yeah, I think it can be really difficult, and I think I wouldn't pretend that, you know, that it's a universal, you know, people are bought into this universally in the UK, and there's been real challenges, I think, with the current government in the UK are not really engaged in this process. We've seen much more interest in the Scottish and Welsh and Irish governments with this. I think there's quite a few ways of sort of answering your question, but I think the first is that trying to build, what we've been trying to do is kind of build a network of people who are trying to do something different, who want to do an alternative, kind of building a network of them so that at least they feel they've got a bit of peer support and there's a kind of reinforcement, and then you can bring new people along. And so they then are also felt supported and feel like they're not alone, that there are ways and means of doing this, that there are alternatives. So I think that's certainly one kind of strategy that we've used in our work. So, you know, building regular communities of practice, regular network conversations where people share what they've been up to and people are able to ask questions and get that kind of that recognition and as well as, I suppose, some affirmation that what they're doing is right and that they should continue and that people have got their back. So I think that's one thing. In terms of the politicians, I think it is about there's a point here about sort of demonstrating that a different world is possible, that an alternative is feasible, that it's cost effective, and that it actually makes an impact on some of their manifesto promises, for example. I think that can be really powerful. And one of the things we're working on at the minute is how do you start to achieve that at scale? So not just in a locality, but across a bigger region. And I think that's something that we're looking at the minute. So, for example, we've done some analysis looking at what's the spending power, what's the economic power if you were to look at government institutions and non-government organizations across a whole region. What does that look like? And when you start to get into that scale, the numbers are big, you know, and the numbers compare well with what, you know, government initiatives. So I think it's that starts to help make the case. And then I think there's also a thing about hearts and minds about, you know, and I think there's something kind of interesting really, because it's about sometimes when you feel like the powers that be are against you. There is, you know, like in the UK, there's been very little oxygen at a central government at Westminster, if you like, in London for these ideas from the national government. And there's also been very little money. So we've had years and years and years of money being reduced for local councils in the UK. And there's been a real, you know, lots of services have disappeared, and lots of communities have seen local provision removed. A lot of social security has disappeared. But there's something in some ways where that is in some senses given people a sense of agency, because well, you've got nothing to lose now. The government don't care. The private sector don't want to invest, so it's up to us. So what can we do, and how can we perhaps build alliances with our local communities, with our local NGOs to make something happen? So I think there is something about that, and I think at the moment there's an energy about that, which is saying, if we are going to have a new government, well, there's really good examples here of where people have done innovative things and done made alternative arrangements, and that's a really powerful story, I think, for a new government potentially in the longer term. But I think a lot of that about the support networks, the peer support, the communication of the ideas and the stories, and the kind of demonstration of impact through the data. I think all of that is kind of part of that conversation. I mean,
I think that's a big thing. It's that boldness to just go and do something.
Yeah.
And even if, as you say, it starts in your street, you do a little litter cleanup on your street, and you tidy up an area and start growing some veggies. That's a start. And I think with social media nowadays, getting those stories out there, it all has a positive effect. For us, I mean, I'm involved here in a thing called Love Cities. It's an initiative trying to get each local town to pull their assets together, to look at get business, get local people, get churches, government, everybody together, and say, what is it that we can do for our particular town? So I'm living in Howick, and this has been the first kind of pilot area. We've done it for the last 7 years. Love Howick is the first one, and there's so many things happening. And then that has now made another one start down the road. And we've now got this kind of national program where small towns in particular, because it's easier to work in a small area, are being encouraged to come together and just, start something which is local based and locally contextual for them. So not every single thing looks exactly the same, because your area might be more agricultural, mine might be more urban, whatever, but it's just getting those stories out. And as you tell other people, they say, oh, wow, we want to do that. And they see that it's possible. I think that's the big thing, because as you say, we stuck on what's worked in the past, and you have to be brave to just say, well, hang on, we're going to try something slightly different. And if you do it and it succeeds and you share the story, I think that's where the magic happens, where people then say, oh, well, they did it. So, Preston's a good idea. Let's go and see what we can do in our area.
Yeah. And I think it's also about sort of challenging. I think sometimes the notion of economy can feel a bit remote, and it can feel like something that is just about the data and about, kind of quite distant from everyday thinking. And I think it's trying to reclaim that and say, no, we're all part of the economy, community, social, that's part of what the economy needs to be,
Any other comments from other colleagues? What's happening in your area? Do you see any of this where you are? Daniel?
Thanks, Janine, and thanks, Sarah and Julian, for a wonderful presentation. And of course, shining the light on the hard question of how to hold governments to account in terms of leading in the redistribution of resources, because it's very easy to talk about growing economies, as you have indicated, but that will only remain a growing economy if on the community level, that does not translate into improved livelihoods or standards of living. And quite often, of course, and riding on what Janine has indicated from the ABCD approach in community development, there is a sense in which, again, data becomes important. It's very easy to generate national data from formalized institutions and economic players. But then there's a lot of activity that is not taking place at the micro level, at the community level, which to a large extent is not captured in national data. And from where we come from, we have a very strong, quote unquote, informal economy, which drives the rest of the economy. It's only that there isn't quantification, and there is no clear idea of how much contribution this informal sector makes to the formal economy. And therefore, then there's a lot of wealth that is happening, that is being generated at the community level, at the micro level, which is not captured and which is not accounted for. And this is possibly where we need now to focus our energies, so that then armed with that data, then we can also leverage on those resources and tell the government, these are the people who are driving the economy, because they are undertaking activities that are transformational at the local level. And so we need to be able then to shift the way we allocate resources at the national level to the benefit of the people who others are not visible in what they do, but all the same, they are making significant contribution to the economy. From the Kenyan perspective, we have self-help groups, community groups, women groups, and they generate a lot of incomes, so that even now there are special purpose accounts for these kind of informal sector operators. The word in the street is that if these informal groups were to take out their money from the banking sector, the whole banking economy will collapse.
Yeah.
But and they deal with very small amounts, but effectively they have huge stake in what happens in the banking sector. And this is what we need now to leverage, so that then we can shine the light on the people who are actually supporting the economy, rather than the quote unquote the extractive economies or the few anchor economies or institutions, which in the back of it all, again, they're also extractive in a way. So thank you.
Yeah, I think for us here in South Africa, the whole informal economy. Hannah and I had a very interesting guest lecturer, Gigi Alcock, who's working in the township economy, which is traditionally it's not regulated. The guys don't pay tax. It's just seen as somebody hustling on the side, selling, potatoes or something like that. But the actual wealth of that whole sector is in the billions. It's like, what did he say? 60 billion rand or something per annum, created by this informal economy. And, there's wealth there. And as Daniel says, if those people weren't doing that, the whole economy of the country would be severely impacted. And it's just how do we bring that in and make it generative, make it benefit everybody in the community.
Yeah, I mean that resonates. We did some work recently on women in the economy, and I mean the work that women do, looking after children, looking after older relatives. I mean the economy across the world would collapse if women didn't do that work as well.
Or had to be paid for it. Yeah.
It's so important to kind of recognize that and value it, I suppose. Yeah.
Any other comments? Jim, would you like to add anything? Devet? Boniface?
Yes, I do want to, and I want to get Boniface into the discussion, because Julian, I'm a little bit concerned about you're talking about communities that in the African continent we get communities that are very isolated and sparsely populated. So the definition of a community becomes very, very important. You could get communities of 500 people distributed over 500 kilometers in this distance. Arguments like that, exaggeration a little bit. But it's all about growth. And if you talk about growth, you're talking about getting money into a community. Otherwise, it's Peter pay for Paul. There's no growth. There cannot be growth. So you need to use local people to get somebody outside to pay to get money in for the growth. I have to export what I do from my community. But then I'm doing exactly on the other target community, which I don't want them to do onto me. It's a conundrum that I find myself running into circles. And I'd like to hear Boniface on this also, because he also worked in very rural communities, subsistence community economy going. And the possibility of growth is only if that product could get out of that community into some other community who's going to pay for it so that we get the money back. Otherwise, I pay you, you pay me, and I pay the other guy.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, what Professor DeWitt is saying is right. And in reference to our area, especially in Kenya, local communities, maybe what I can say is the issue of culture. When we are talking of building community assets, community wealth, we need also to put into consideration the cultural practices which in most of the cases actually impede or affect the wealth building. When we talk of community, I agree with the prof, we need to define and operationalize the word community, because most of the time, especially these communities based on location, like the rural communities, cultural practices make them very conservative, to even to the extent of resisting change, which the government itself, the same government that maybe we might criticize in a way, has the resources, but the status quo remains for these rural communities, for these communities. That is my case in our country. And when we talk of development from below, is actually a very nice model. But again, my opinion is we need to build community wealth in a blended manner. We need to apply both aspects. We need to hear the side of the communities. We need to hear the side of the local government. We need to hear the side of the government. So we need people to sit on the table from different corners, from different departments, for us to have inclusivity and to have a comprehensive framework that is people-driven. Thank you.
Thanks, Boniface. Do you want to respond, Sarah and Julian? And then Abdul will come to you.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I think it's a really good challenge to us. And I think, I mean, we're speaking very much from a kind of UK context where I think, Boniface, you mentioned about balance, and I think we feel the balance in the UK has gone in the other direction, and that we want to see the balance kind of come back more in favour of people rather than I guess what we would see as quite extractive practices. So I don't think we're saying that you have one or the other, or that you don't have any growth at all. I think what we're trying to say in the UK, we feel it's shifted, it's shifted. The balance has shifted, so we're not seeing, a proper collaboration between different economic players in an area, or indeed between organisations and communities. We're seeing communities very much at the receiving end of the economy, rather than feeling that they have got a stake in it or a connection. So I don't think we're trying to advocate a kind of protectionist model here, or one that we kind of build a wall around and we don't have people coming in or out. But we're trying to say that we do need a balance, we do need a blend, and I would absolutely agree with you on that. But I think there's something here about the ownership, about who owns the wealth in a place, and who gets to benefit from it. And I think those are the kind of questions that we want to encourage people to ask, whether it's in the UK or elsewhere, about when growth happens, and appreciate the fact that if it's a very dispersed community, very rural, very isolated, then it isn't simply about saying, well, you just leave it at that. But it is, as you say, about the blend and about the balance.
Julian, would you like to add something? And then we'll go to the two hands up, Abdul and Jim.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to hear these thoughts, and I think it makes me reflect on how community wealth building, as we've discussed it, is quite specific to the UK, in the sense that we've had like a long history of capitalist accumulation and government kind of becoming increasingly powerful in the economy and at different levels, and even at local government. And I suppose when you think about a place that has like a lot of kind of subsistence farming or kind of low productivity agriculture, then where there isn't surplus being generated that can be kind of tapped into by the local government, then it's a very different context. And I guess it's about working with the grain in that place and bringing some of the principles that we've discussed maybe. And I think about some of the issues of like kind of rents-based corruption, like rents being distributed through informal means, and where the informal economy is really strong. There are going to have to be really different channels of how some of these ideas can be applied. And I guess trying to I think about some of the work on the kind of political economy of development, and how you can acknowledge that there's always corruption in places where the economy is at kind of a low starting point, as it was in the UK hundreds of years ago. Like there's always those incentive structures which affect how resources are spread. And I guess it's about figuring out some mechanisms where the incentives of people in power can be kind of aligned with their communities a bit more. And it's not easy. It's not an easy process, and it's a long-term process of change. And democratization is a big part of that. But let's hear from other people.
Abdul?
Thank you very much. I find the discussion very, very insightful. What my major takeaway is that we are from different communities, or rather, for example, the Manchester community is a fully integrated formal capitalist economy. Why in our own case here in Sub-Saharan Africa, most of our economy, you cannot call it capitalist, you can rather call it communal in nature. And as such, the nature of our community wealth building is a bit unique. And as such, my major takeaway is that if we can understand these two different dynamics of community, will go a long way understanding why the application of the anchor institutions may be difficult in our own case, because here the institutions are almost not functioning at all, especially the what you can call local county or local government. That's on the other side. Then on one other side is that, take for instance, in our own case in Nigeria, the informal economy is not really integrated into the banking sector. So the amount of, the number of people that have savings or open an account is very limited because of history of collapse of banks in Nigeria, wherein some people lost their money, and as such, people are skeptical of savings in banks, and as such, they prefer to have what we call the local savings. We have different communities, we have different communal communities that they have their own local banking sector in which somebody goes about in the morning, he collects the contribution, and then at the end of the week or the day, the month, if somebody wants to take a loan, they give him the loan and the rest of them. So in that case, you can see this is the nature of our own community. One other important thing I would love to all of us to understand is we also, it will going to be interesting if we can research on the effect of, because in Nigeria there was a move to change our currency, the design of our currency, and during the period of the design of the currency, the change of the currency, there was an enforcement of people go and drop the currency and then get the new one. During that time, there was an upsurge. We saw a lot of money coming out. That means the majority of the money people have is not in the banking sector, just like in some other places. So the implication of that is that it means that the informal economy is contributing a lot to the economy, but the GDP and GNP, but unfortunately, it is not being captured because they are not formally registered. I think this is another area that our sub-Saharan members should also research into, the extent of community wealth building, especially among the informal sector, and what can be done about it. Because we saw a lot of money that time, we are surprised, and then we could see a villager that we think is under poverty, but then the amount of money he brought to take to the bank for to get the new currency shows a different story altogether. So Daniel and some of us in the Sub-Sahara, especially some of us in West Africa, I think it's a very big assignment for us. So basically, the And then the extent to which, that means what I'm saying is I'm just raising some pertinent areas. To what extent can the anchor institutions, for example, work for us, considering the fact that our economy is not even integrated into the international economy system, which is the banking sector? This gives me a lot of thought, and then I'll also continue to extend this thought so that we can be able to find a way of developing something out of it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Abdul. Sarah, I know that you need to leave us very shortly for another meeting, but before that, I want to just go over to Jim. If you need to leave, that's fine. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being with us today. It's been so insightful, and we look forward to keeping an eye on what the community wealth building is doing. I'm fascinated. Thank you so much. Jim.
Yes, I'm really interested in this comment that Sarah and Julian made of how do we create a mindset shift. And the assumption in the UK I have, Sarah, is that people I meet who've done economics degrees at university or related things, community wealth building doesn't even appear on a curriculum. So in some senses, my assumption in the African and international context that, again, there's a challenge to how do we include some kind of thinking in relation to community wealth building as a bottom line module, in all economics kind of courses. And I suppose my assumption is that the extractive model, that as you called it, is very, very dominant, in terms of the learning programs. And I suppose a challenge to Daniel and my colleagues in IACD is that what is the mindset of IACD as far as economic development is concerned? And again, I suppose my hope in terms of the session this morning is an effort to begin to change the mindset in IACD to adopt some of the kind of principles and some of the values that were actually there. So I suppose I see today's session as a bit of a challenge both to the universities, where we have the links, as well as to IACD itself, in terms of its kind of future engagement and future programs. As how does this idea of shared community wealth moving the thinking and in terms of that line between extractive and sharing. So again, very, very, very kind of central to challenge to IACD, Daniel, as well as to the universities that are represented here, for whatever country they're in terms of this kind of thinking, the mindset you called it, which is absolutely bottom line in relation to these things. And as you highlighted, the mindset in the UK, has changed hugely, over the last decade between the Scottish policies and the Welsh policies and the English policies, where in England, where I live, the northeast of England, then the extractive ideas are very, very dominant. And life expectancy, as you've highlighted, is going down in the areas where I live here, and other social conditions. So anyway, thanks very much for the challenging us to think about where does our mindset lie.
Yeah.
If I could just come in there briefly, Janine, I think I like that idea. I like the way you've described that, Jim, in terms of sharing extractive, and I think that is the challenge. And I think there's also something, I agree with you as well about, economics tends to be taught in quite a narrow way by universities across the world, and I think it's about saying, economics you need to have quite a pluralistic approach to economics, and that's how economics started. If you look at the origins of economics, it was very much a social science, and it's become very driven down a very narrow mathematical path. And I think we've kind of got to reclaim some of that, so that we're recognizing. So when you look at an informal economy like you've been describing, that's the economy. That's not some sort of marginal activity. That is what keeps this place going. We should celebrate it. We should value it, and it should be part of how we understand the economy of a place. So But I'm apologies, I've got to leave a bit early, but it's been really interesting for us, and thank you for the opportunity to come along. And I think it's a good challenge for us as well, and a good way of us keeping ourselves fresh and thinking about our work in different contexts. So thank you, Janine, and the rest of the team.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Yeah, I think, Jim, that's a good challenge, and it's a good thing that IACD is busy doing our new strategy and looking at our objectives and so on, because that's one of the things that we are grappling with, is this idea of agency, and making sure that people are in the center of community development. So definitely it's a topic of the day. Any final comments from anybody?
Janine, just a quick comment on, again, from what Jim is indicating, that of course this is an opportunity for us to reflect, because to a large extent, the model of development has, to a large extent, for quite a long time, been modeled by the economists. And as Sarah has indicated, they went more into what is quantifiable, but most of what really makes sense in development is very qualitative and quantifiable, and much of it lives in the stories of the communities. And that is now where we need to focus. This model as given is one of the tools that we can use to indicate how community development should not be done. Because to a large extent, if we are looking at the models of anchor economies, and with the globalization, all these big corporations are profit driven. It doesn't matter where they are located. And if there is no profit, if there is no extracting of surplus in whatever they are domiciled, they have no business. They wake up and in the morning you find they are gone. In some cases, we'll talk about the responsibility that they have to communities, but much of it again is very extractive and very tokenistic. And it's a question of now looking at how now we reorient the process and then challenge the asymmetry in power, so that ultimately communities can exercise their agency to be able then to drive the development agenda, irrespective of the presence of the big agencies or quote unquote organizations that they exist. And again, as DeWitt has indicated, in some of the places we'll never have these agencies in place. So communities have to pull themselves together and make a difference in development. But that is a discourse that then, as we are looking at the next strategy, maybe we can look at how do we start shining the light in some of those places which are contested, and some of the also models that are disruptive of the trend of people uplifting themselves by exercising their agency. So thank you very much, and thanks so much, colleagues, for making this happen. So there is always so much that we can do. The challenge is, can we start documenting? Can we start researching? And this is a forum for us again to see how now we put together our energies to make a difference.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much, everyone. And again, very special thanks to Julian and to Sarah for coming in and sharing your story with us. It's been fascinating, and let's hope that we do keep in touch. And thank you for challenging us and stimulating our thought patterns. You've given us a lot to go away with. I just want to mention that our next webinar will be 12th of June. And this time we're going to have Laura Berg from the Green Light Movement in South Africa, who is going to share with us this evaluation tool that is really fantastic. It's an excellent evaluation tool that does more than just evaluate people's poverty levels, but it helps to stimulate their thought processes about their own aspirations of what can I do to move myself closer to being less poor, basically. So there will be some adverts going out. Just diarize that for now. 12th of June is on the green light. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jessica, and enjoy the rest of your day, evening, afternoon, whatever it is, wherever you are. Take care, everybody.